On the morning of September 29, 1833, the Royal Palace of Madrid was cloaked in an eerie silence. Behind gilded doors and marble corridors, all grandeur seemed to collapse into misery. In his private bedchamber, King Ferdinand VII of Spain lay dying. He was only 48, but his body had been hollowed out by disease, twisted by years of unchecked indulgence. Syphilis, the venereal plague of the age, had eaten into his flesh, leaving ulcers across his skin and agony in every movement. The same man who had so often proclaimed himself the guardian of Catholic virtue now faced a death as humiliating as it was painful. The palace doctors hovered helplessly around him, applying treatments that offered no relief, while his groans echoed down the silent corridors. Spain's king, once cheered as El Deseado, the Desired, was reduced to a figure of horror and pity. It was a cruel irony. Here was a ruler who had wrapped himself in the language of tradition and morality, a monarch who claimed to defend faith and family, yet who was destroyed by the very sins he indulged in with reckless abandon. The spectacle of his final days begged a deeper question: how had Ferdinand become the most reviled monarch in Spanish history, branded not just as a tyrant but as the most perverted king the nation had ever known? To answer that, we must turn back the clock and trace his path from birth to disgrace, from a boy raised in suspicion to a king who left his country in ruins. Ferdinand was born on October 14, 1784, in the shadow of the great Escorial Palace, a symbol of Spain's once glorious empire. From the moment of his birth, he carried the burden of destiny. As the eldest surviving son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, Ferdinand was expected to inherit not only a crown but the legacy of a global power stretching across Europe and the Americas. Yet behind the thick walls of the royal palace, his childhood was anything but idyllic. The Bourbon court into which Ferdinand was born was a nest of rivalry, intrigue, and open hostility. At its center stood Queen Maria Luisa, a woman known for her sharp tongue, overbearing influence, and brazen favoritism toward her lover, Manuel Godoy. Godoy, once a guard of humble origins, had risen to the pinnacle of power as Spain's prime minister through the Queen's patronage. He was detested by many Spaniards, who blamed him for corruption and military failures. But to the young Ferdinand, Godoy represented something even worse: a usurper in his own family, a man who held his mother's loyalty more firmly than her own son ever could. The relationship between Ferdinand and his mother was poisoned from the beginning. She treated him with cold disdain, rarely hiding her contempt, while lavishing her affection and trust upon Godoy. The young prince grew up convinced that his future was under constant threat. He believed, not without reason, that Godoy would stop at nothing to exclude him from government, even from succession. As he matured, this sense of exclusion and betrayal hardened into paranoia, and from paranoia into ruthless ambition. By his 20s, Ferdinand was already conspiring against both Godoy and his parents. In 1807, he and his supporters hatched what became known as the El Escorial conspiracy. Their plan was audacious, even treasonous. They reached out to Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, seeking his aid in removing Godoy and forcing Charles IV to abdicate. It was a betrayal of father and country alike, but Ferdinand's thirst for power had no boundaries. The plot unraveled quickly. Godoy learned of the scheme and presented the evidence to the king. Guards stormed Ferdinand's rooms and uncovered letters that exposed his dealings with Napoleon. The scandal was a bombshell. For the heir to Spain's throne to have invited a foreign ruler to meddle in domestic affairs shocked the nation. Ferdinand was arrested, publicly humiliated, and threatened with disinheritance. But faced with ruin, he revealed his truest nature. He betrayed his fellow conspirators, handing their names to the authorities in a desperate bid to save himself. He even wrote groveling letters to his parents, begging forgiveness and offering to kneel at their feet. Incredibly, his pleas worked. His punishment was light, his treachery forgiven, and the pattern of his life was set. Ferdinand would always betray others to preserve himself, and he would always escape the consequences. When Napoleon's grip over Europe faltered, Spain was left in chaos. In 1808, Charles IV abdicated under pressure, and Ferdinand ascended the throne. But his reign lasted only weeks. Napoleon, ever the strategist, invited both father and son to Bayonne, France, under the guise of mediation. There, he pressured Ferdinand to abdicate in favor of his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Betrayed and powerless, Ferdinand became a prisoner in France, confined in gilded captivity for 6 long years, while Spain bled in the brutal Peninsular War. The Spanish people fought and died in his name, but their king lived comfortably far away, waiting for the chance to reclaim his throne. When Napoleon finally fell in 1814, Ferdinand was released. His return to Spain was a spectacle. Crowds lined the roads, showering him with praise, hailing him as El Deseado, the desired. To a war-weary nation, he symbolized hope, renewal, and deliverance from French domination. For a brief moment, it seemed Spain might embark on a new era of constitutional monarchy, guided by the liberal constitution of 1812. Ferdinand promised to uphold it, to work with those who had risked everything during the war. But his promises were lies. Within weeks, he tore the constitution to shreds, restored absolute monarchy, and unleashed a wave of repression. Liberal leaders who had once fought in his name found themselves jailed, exiled, or executed. The king who had returned as a hero revealed himself as a tyrant. Yet as dark as his political record was, Ferdinand's private life carried scandals even more shocking. His marriages read like tragedies tinged with horror. His first wife, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples, his own cousin, found him repulsive. Their marriage produced no children, only 2 miscarriages, and ended with her untimely death at just 21. Whispers of poisoning circulated through the courts, deepening the sense of scandal. His second marriage, to his niece Maria Isabel of Portugal, ended in an even more grotesque tragedy. In 1818, during a troubled childbirth, doctors mistakenly believed she had died. In a desperate attempt to save the baby, they performed a caesarean section, only for the young queen to scream in agony as the blade cut into her. She bled to death in front of horrified witnesses. She too was only 21. Undeterred, Ferdinand married again in 1819, this time to 16-year-old Maria Josepha of Saxony, a devout girl raised in strict Catholic piety. On their wedding night, she was so terrified by her husband that she fled in panic, and for much of their marriage, she refused intimacy except after prayer. The union remained childless, and she died at 25, leaving behind little more than stories of humiliation and dread. Ferdinand's final wife, another niece, Maria Cristina of Naples, was chosen not for love but for necessity. He desperately needed an heir, and she was young, fertile, and politically convenient. She gave him 2 daughters, but no son. And in Spain, the law of succession still demanded a male heir. Facing the prospect that his brother, Don Carlos, would take the throne, Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, altering the law so that his daughter Isabella could inherit. It was a fateful decision, one that enraged Carlos and his supporters, and one that would plunge Spain into civil war after the king's death. While his personal life spiraled into grotesque tragedy, Ferdinand's political decisions dragged Spain deeper into ruin. Under his rule, Spain lost nearly all of its colonies in the Americas. Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru all broke free. The empire that had once stretched across continents was reduced to fragments: Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The economic consequences were devastating. The crown lost its colonial revenues, the treasury emptied, and debt soared. Taxes were raised, corruption flourished, and the army became a constant drain on resources. While Spain lost most of its American colonies and the treasury ran dry, Ferdinand tightened his grip through censorship and repression. In 1823, when liberals forced him to briefly accept the Constitution of 1812, he called upon France and the so-called Holy Alliance to restore him. 100,000 French troops marched into Spain, crushed the liberals, and reinstated his absolute rule. It was a victory for Ferdinand but a humiliation for Spain, a reminder that its king would rather kneel to foreign powers than compromise with his own people. Small wonder that Spaniards gave him a new title, El Rey Felon, the criminal king. By the early 1830s, his health was failing. Years of disease and excess had left his body weak and deformed. Yet even in his decline, Ferdinand remained obsessed with securing his line. His decision to name his daughter heir ensured that Spain would not find peace after his death. On September 29, 1833, his life ended in agony, his body consumed by syphilis. He left the throne to his 3-year-old daughter, Isabella II, under the regency of Queen Maria Cristina. But Don Carlos refused to accept it. His claim ignited the First Carlist War, a bloody civil conflict that tore Spain apart for years to come. Thus ended the reign of Ferdinand VII, a reign defined by betrayal, repression, and scandal. His legacy is a trail of wreckage, a shattered empire, a divided nation, and a monarchy stained by infamy. He is remembered not for glory but for disgrace, not for courage but for cowardice, and above all for the grotesque contradictions of his life. The king who paraded as the guardian of faith died the victim of his own vice. The monarch hailed as the desired became the most despised. Nearly 2 centuries later, his name still provokes outrage and fascination. Was Ferdinand VII truly the most perverted king in history, or simply the most unfortunate example of a monarch undone by his own vices? That question lingers, a reminder of how power, when corrupted by desire and betrayal, can drag not just a man, but an entire nation, into ruin. What do you think? Was Ferdinand truly the most perverse king in history? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories of history's darkest figures. Thanks.